Anyway, let's start. It's 6:30 and good evening, everybody. I'm Hunter Ohanian. I'm the director of the Stonewall National Museum and Archives here in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and we're very happy to have all of you here. And we're also very happy to have Michelle Handelman with us. Hello, Michelle. How are you?
Fine,
Nice,
Hunter. So
nice,
great to see you.
nice to see you as well, too. Where are we finding you this evening?
In my studio in Brooklyn, New York.
Oh my God. Well, so how are you dealing with the pandemic and everything? It's been a long slog. So tell us, how are you doing?
I'm doing all right. I think when you're an artist, you're so used to just holding up in your own space and losing yourself in your work. So I've been trying to do that, though, for the first 6 months, it was just impossible to focus on anything really other than figuring out how you were going to get things and then how do you wash things once they come in and who do you call and who are your lifelines and but luckily my gallery Signs and Symbols, the gallery that I work with in New York, kind of forced me into doing a couple of short pieces over the spring and summer. So I made a couple of very short pandemic videos,
Hmm.
which is very different from how I work, to actually conceive of something and edit it and complete it within 2 to 3 weeks
Mhm.
is something I never do. Usually it's 2 to 3 years for me to finish a project. Um, so that's been actually really eye-opening and a different sort of satisfaction to think, make, put it out there so quickly and have it be so pertinent to, what is happening in the moment.
And so you were telling me the other day that you were actually at the Rauschenberg Foundation, right, in Captiva when it happened, and when the beginning of the pandemic happened, and everybody was sent home, which must have been very shocking.
Yeah, it was shocking and very disappointing because it's so beautiful there on Captiva. And we were all like, reaching our stride and just getting into our work. I was working on this new project called Delirium, which is a new large scale multi screen performance installation, which I'm, just at the beginning of. So I was just starting to get into it. And then boom, like you're on that plane. They gave us our little go bag of an N95 mask and rubber gloves and sent us home. And I barely left the house since then, really.
Yeah, well, it's perfectly understandable. For those of you who don't know about Stonewall, we're located here in South Florida, in Fort Lauderdale. We have the largest LGBTQ library in the United States, 28,000 volumes. And in our archives, we have over 6 million pages of queer history going back roughly to the 1950s to the present day. In addition, we do a lot of exhibitions and we do talks and lectures. And this series that we're doing now is one that we started in the beginning of the pandemic. And it's really a way to connect artists and writers and thinkers about different gay topics in a virtual way. So tonight's talk is being recorded. It will be posted on our website. You can see all the past people who've participated. I think we are booked through March or April at this point, which is really great. And so we always want new ideas. If you have any ideas, please feel free to reach out to us. I want to do a shout out to Emery Grant, who is our deputy director, who's behind the scenes here. And you may see him pop up in a minute or two. There he is. Hello, Emery. Nice to see you. Thank you. And so Emery's there helping us, making sure all this happens. We have one exhibition up right now at the museum. It's called Life Letters, and it's expressions of love between people in the LGBTQ community. And that will be up until the end of December. And then tomorrow, Friday, we'll be opening a new exhibition called Queers at Home. And this is looking at gay domestic life going back to the 1950s. They're wonderful snapshots of people at home, as well as telling the story through different publications. And so we will be doing a curated talk of that show online, virtually, of course, I think 2 weeks from tomorrow. And then also the entire exhibition will be available online, like we're doing with all of that. So we are open to the general public. And if you are in South Florida, please feel free to come by and see us. And you can find out everything you can imagine about Stonewall by going to stonewall-museum.org. So thank you very much for all of that. And for our friends on Facebook, thank you for joining us as well. We understand that there are a number of people there watching, and so that's great. So again, Michelle, it's great to see you, and I'm very happy to have you here. And just to let people know a little bit about your background before we dig in all this, presently you are working at FIT and have started a film department there, which is great. How long have you been doing that?
I've been there about 7 years now.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah.
Michelle and I worked together at Leslie Lohman, and also we ended up being at Mass Art at the same time as well too. And so we've worked it together in a number of different environments. So it's nice to connect again this way. If you are not familiar with Michelle's background, please go to her website, michellehandelman.com. But she has an amazing resume. The number of exhibitions that she's been in, amazing reviews, amazing articles. I mean, she really has molded this part of the queer art world for the last 30 or 40 years. And it's really, if I can't say 40, 20 or 30 years. And,
yeah, but it's close.
Yeah, it sneaks up.
I know.
And, you know, I mean, in addition to a Guggenheim Fellowship and a Creative Capital Fellowship, I mean, you in residencies and so many exhibitions. I mean, Michelle has worked very hard to tell some of these stories and bring them out through the work that she actually has. And so I'm really pleased to speak to you tonight about your work. And it's great to connect with you about it this way.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's always great to talk with you every time we have a chance to chat. I really treasure those. And I love what you're doing at the archive. So I'm just honored and excited to be here.
Thank you. Thank you. So this is the 25th anniversary of sort of a major piece of work for you. You know, so BloodSisters, Leather, Dykes and Sadomasochism is the full title. First of all, how does it feel to be at a 25th anniversary of a major piece like this?
That's a good question. No one ever starts out with that question because it's really bizarre. You know, I didn't plan on doing this 25-year anniversary tour at all. And I hadn't even thought about it. But about a year ago, a couple of festivals in Europe started to reach out to me, places, you know, I had shown it 25 years ago. And, you know, programmers who I knew and was still friends with, and they were saying, hey, I've got these young curators and they want to show BloodSisters. And I was like, really? That old film? You know, like, why do they want it? It's like old and on that old thing. And it's like shot on high 8 and it looks like shit. And like, okay, you want to look at that? And so little by little, people started to come to me. Bradford Nordine, who runs Dirty Looks, the queer screening series, he was the first one in the US to come to me, and he put together a show, I think it was fall 2019, at the Tom of Finland House in Los Angeles. And so then I started to look at the film again. And to be honest with you, I had totally forgotten that the entire title of the film was BloodSisters, Leather, Dykes and Sadomasochism. I have been calling it BloodSisters for so long, I forgot there was a longer title.
I had to write it down to be sure I had the full title right.
And I couldn't believe it. I was like, oh my God, yeah, I guess I had a longer title for this. And so as I started to watch it again, I realized, you know, and like fix things and start to, you know, retool it, I realized hey, this really isn't as bad as I imagined it was. And um, that actually, it really holds up. And this is amazing. And next year is going to be the 25-year anniversary. So why don't I plan a tour? And, then I get to travel around the world and see everyone I hadn't seen for ages and, meet new people and have a whole new experience with it. So I reached out and we were set to premiere the tour at the BFI in London back in March, the BFI Flair Festival, and then other places to follow. And, then the pandemic hit.
Right.
And so, my dream of traveling around and going to see everyone, of course, never came to fruition. But eventually, after the shock of the pandemic, and the festivals all shut down, but finally people started to pull together and figure out, how are we going to live online now? And how are we going to experience culture online? And Outfest was the first festival to really pull it all together. So in August, they presented the now premiere of the 25-year anniversary tour, and they did a big panel with it that was live, and it was fantastic. And so it feels amazing. It really does. For so many years, like when I first made the film, it had a big splash, but it wasn't loved and welcomed like it is now. It was always this film like, sure, we're going to screen it because everyone's screening it. But there was always this little backstory of like, we're going to get in trouble for this. We really shouldn't be showing this, but we're going to do it. We're going to do it anyway. And no one embraced it. It was almost like people tolerated it, except for, of course, a handful of people that were much more progressive and political. So to see it come out now and to see how it's almost, I don't think it was ahead of its time, because it was very much of its time. But the message that it has is speaking now. And it took a whole other generation to discover what BloodSisters really has to say and how important the things are that these women in the film are saying, which is why I made the film to begin with. It was always about these women's voices and how strong and powerful and politicized their lives had become based on their sexuality. And it was that combination of sexuality and activism that spurred me on to make this film. And so I'm just so grateful to talk to these 25-year-old curators who tell me how grateful they are that they have this film and that they feel like a piece of their history has been given back to them. And it just, know this is going to sound schmaltzy, but it really just moves me to no end.
I'm sure.
It's like the best thing an artist could have, to have this work that just inspires people and gives people strength.
It's also interesting too, because it raises the question that as we look at work from any period of time, that when it is current and contemporary of the moment, we may have a very visceral, real response to it, which is either positive or negative, and that we don't really know where to put it. But if it is of another generation, then there is that distance that allows us to look at it more fully and look at it more innocently. And that may be what has happened with you and this particular film, that if you're seeing a younger audience who are interested in it, it doesn't seem as threatening or as I don't know, confrontational possibly for them, and how they put it in their own context. And so it's nice to have it seen through a new set of eyes, and because of course everything we see now, we only see through our own eyes. We only see what happens now. and we have all these responses to it. But I can totally imagine. The film came out in 1995.
95.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I can totally imagine that there were a lot of people who felt that they had to be involved in it, but yet they felt like that there was something that was not okay about it in some way, and they were just going along with it. So we're gonna look at a clip a clip of it in a minute. But just for the audience, just set up a little bit about how the film came to be, why you made it. I mean, you just told us a lot about really sort of the high level of why you made the film, but tell us a little bit more about, how it actually happened.
Well, how it actually happened was um, really through my dear friend Scott Chatsky, who was a master piercer at the Gauntlet at that time
In San Francisco.
in
Yeah.
San Francisco, and which was the first Gauntlet and the first piercing salon in the U.S.
Is he still upstairs there on Market Street, right at the corner of?
I think they've shut down.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. But
Yeah,
I
yeah, but
remember.
that's where they were,
Yeah, yeah,
exactly,
yeah.
upstairs. And I had moved to San Francisco in '86,
Yeah.
and I had been there for a while. Yeah, and I had been involved in S&M in various forms in my life in different ways, but I wasn't part of the scene in San Francisco. And so through Scott, I met Skeeter and Jamie, who are key in the film, and particularly Skeeter, who really kind of leads you through the entire film. And Skeeter and Jamie were actually roommates with Scott. They were choreographers and producers and big players in the scene. And they said, hey, you should come to the International Ms. Leather Contest. It's like happening next week. We'll put you on the list. So I was like, sure. And so I went to the show by myself, and it was amazing. And, I knew it was going to be this wild, sexy, crazy event. But what I didn't expect was that it was also going to be this hardcore left-wing consciousness raising event, and that there was activism and political force tied in with every single scene that got played out on stage, with every speech anyone made. And
Wow.
it kind of blew my mind, I
Wow.
have to say. I just, this, to me, that just seems so intelligent, that somehow you could combine your sexual pleasure with political agency.
Mhm.
And really, it really wasn't just a smart thing to do. It was a way of survival,
Mm.
because you had to, because, you're already, these are outcasts within outcasts. The gay community at that time shunned the leather community, always never wanted them in the parades. I mean, I talk to young people now who tell me it's still that way, actually,
Yeah.
which really surprises me. So anyway, that night, I remember I just turned to this woman next to me. I don't know who she was. And I said, oh my God, this is amazing. Someone's got to make a film about this.
Mm.
But I really didn't think it was me. I'm not a documentary filmmaker. This is the only documentary I ever made. And sure enough, like 6 months later, there was a grant proposal that was up, and I was like, oh, why don't I do the Leather Dyke film? And I got the grant, threw myself into the project, and 2 years later, we were premiering at Frameline.
Wow. Wow.
So it was really Skeeter and Jamie who gave me access, and having their blessing allowed me to go into spaces and shoot,
Yeah.
and really get to know people.
Yeah, and of course the interviews that are in the film are just very powerful, and you got to meet a lot of great people in doing it. But also it's wonderful that it sounds, for you as an artist, that being in that experience also freed you up to be able to see the political power of what was going on. There was the personal motivation and the artistic motivation, but then the political motivation was a big thing as well too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just, fell in love with everyone, of course, and admired them all so much.
Well,
And
let's look at the clip.
okay, let me show you a clip. So I'm going to show, I think it's about 3.5 minutes.
And folks, while we're setting up here, just let everybody know, we'll save the last 10 or 15 minutes for quick questions, but if you have them, keep on throwing them up into the chat and to the Q&A boxes. I'm seeing some comments coming up here, which are great. And we will be adding some of these. Oh, someone has added here that the Gauntlet in San Francisco closed in the late 90s. That would be my sense as well too. I certainly remember going up those stairs and seeing that. And there was like a gas station right next to it. It's truly, I remember it being right at the corner of Market and Castro.
Yeah, right. I remember the gas station too.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. Excuse me, it's 10 o'clock. Do I know where my children are? Where are they? There's one. There's some over there. There's two over there. Well, I had a speech written, but all I have to say is, because I'm the mommy, that's why.
There's a primary difference between non-consensual abuse and a consensual decision to play with power. And I'm not going to say that there aren't people who jump that line, but if you have defined with somebody what you want and what you find erotic, what you find sensual, and you choose to do this together, that's not abuse.
Which is like psychological abuse play, I think is the most difficult because it involves interacting with thinking. And it's hard to second guess in a way, like someone's, 4 quarts of blood drain onto someone, you know that they're 8, so you've got 4 to go.
Really?
But how do you know the limits of psychological devastation? It's an inside-out job that's very different. How do you monitor? How do you monitor? Fear, how do you monitor?
It's a spiritual thing for me. It's a way for me to go someplace else besides here. And it's a way for me to take everything that happens to me outside that hurts, make hurt reality, and then it can heal for me. That's what happens. And it's a way to get close to people. You really have to trust somebody to do this stuff.
I don't believe for a minute that there aren't people who abuse their power in the SM lifestyle. I know they do. There are people who will do that. They'll abuse their power at a candy store, wherever they are. But, you have a choice.
So I like to raise those questions like, when is it battering? I don't know. Because certainly I have used SM as violence against women. Sex is a weapon. Truly.
And for a lot of people, there's this whole thing of the wall, of breaking through these walls. If the bottoms are saying, I can't take this, the top saying, I can't keep doing this, I don't believe I'm doing this. Every now and then it's like, God, I am a sick fuck. What am I doing this for? I can't believe I'm doing this to somebody. And then you go through it, and you go past it, and you do hit that high. You do hit that endorphin rush. And then that's one more thing I can do. That's one more step I can take. And that's one more layer of bullshit that's been pushed on me that I got past.
It just gives you so much more. I have the ability to negotiate what I will and will not have in my experiences. I didn't have that years ago. Things just happen. Shit happens and you're just part of it. Well, shit seldom happens to me now.
You can do very intense things to a person's body and they will be fine the next day. If you take care of somebody, they're okay. So, and that's the primary difference with abuse. You can abuse somebody even lightly, totally non-consensual stuff. They're not fine the next day, and they're not fine the next week, and it's going to take a long time to get over the fact that they were abused. That's leaving them psychologically damaged. Consensual SM is leaving somebody stronger.
Wonderful, wonderful clip. And so just a procedural question. If somebody wants to see the full film now, how can they do that?
Well, right now, the film is available on Amazon. So you can stream it or buy it there. But it'll soon be coming off of Amazon because Kino Lorber is going to be re-releasing it this spring. So they're planning, they'll be doing a whole new release. We'll be putting together a lot of like extras. Both, they're going to be selling both a disc, and we'll do streaming on all the platforms. And we'll also have a lot of bonus tracks. So be on the lookout for that. You know, if you want to find out more, you can always go to my website, and you can either email me, or I think you can sign up for my mailing list there, and I'll be sending out announcements when it's ready.
So let's talk a little bit about the clip that we saw in the interviews. And so you were introduced to a number of those people through the connections that you had made there in San Francisco at the time. And as you say, this was the first documentary that you made. So now again, as you look at it 25 years later, you had said earlier you felt that it held up. But talk to us a little bit about what your feeling is as you actually see it at this point now.
Well, there's so many feelings as I actually see it. I mean, so many people who I maintain the closest relationships with after the film, Wiki Stamps, the writer, and Tala Brandeis, who was just an all-out incredible trans woman who was the wit mistress throughout the film, are both dead. They both died definitely within the last 8 years. I can't remember exactly when, but so that's really sad. Reconnecting with a lot of the people who are still around right now has been really wonderful, though. So there's so much love still with everyone, and that feels incredible. But I feel what's so important, that I think what the film is saying, and it still feels important to me and kind of gives me chills at times, is talking about this relationship between pain and pleasure, and how riding that line is, not only dangerous physically, but mentally, and how complicated that is in relationship to one's pleasure. And also outside of that, how complicated it is in relationship to society and culture, who has, really positioned anything having to do with S&M as basically the devil, Satan, the worst thing you could imagine. And so that struggle and that fight to be who you are against all adversity, just it just sort of brings me to tears and really hits me deep inside. And I get that every time I watch the film, I still feel it.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear you say that. And also, I think, as you spoke about some of the political consequence or the political impact that happened too, what I liked about the particular clip that you just showed was the discussion between the discussion about the difference between abuse and power, and really understanding those two things, and consensual relinquishment of power to somebody else, and the exchange of power, and where the power does rest within two individuals versus abuse. And those are indeed, and I think the film really makes that point very well, that those are very different topics.
And every single relationship is a power relationship. There is always a power dynamic going on within friends, work, lovers, you name it. And that is also what you're talking about here. And that is what is denied by people who are, vehemently anti-S&M. The people who speak out against it aren't really taking the time to understand that their lives, that everyone's lives, is constructed through power relationships. And finding that balance is something every human being needs to do on a daily basis.
Yeah, I mean, we have to negotiate it whether we're on the subway or whether we're going to work or whether we're in the grocery store. There is a power dynamic in each of those relationships. And you're absolutely right that we have to deal with it, which of course, as we're saying, is very different than those that are abusive. And I loved the idea that, abuse you can feel that the next day or the next week or the next month, as opposed to a consensual exchange of power is really a very strong and consensual relationship between, or experience between two people.
Yeah. One of the other things, this is a segue to something else, but one of the other things I realized why this film is speaking so loudly right now is because now we have this public conversation on trans identity and radical sexuality and gender fluidity, which was not a public conversation during the early 90s. And in fact, all of the people that started that public conversation, like Judith Butler, Patrick Califia, Susan Stryker, almost all of them are actually were a part of BloodSisters in some way, whether they're in the film or were advisors to the film. And so in that way, I guess in that way, you could say it was ahead of its time because it was capturing that burgeoning academic and historical conversation about gender fluidity. And now that's a public conversation. And so now that fear has been lifted. And so people can see, oh, this is where it started. I mean, modern day, this is where it started. And San Francisco was really unique during the 90s in terms of everything, in terms of radical sexuality and queer politics. It was really far ahead of any other city in the country at that moment in time.
Yeah. And of course, there are those that have written, the whole notion of sexuality and an active role in a less conventional sexual life is one of the best performance pieces out there, or one of the best political actions that can actually happen out there. And I think there's a lot to be said about that as well. But you raised a quick question about transgender individuals. And so let's use that as a segue to talk about Flawless Sabrina.
Okay, that's a good segue.
Tell everybody a little bit about Flawless.
Well, Flawless passed away a few years ago. Flawless Sabrina was a renowned drag performer and mostly known very early on for starting the drag competitions in the late 1950s, early 1960s, and they were called the Nationals. Flawless was not transgender, but Flawless actually made a point of making sure that all of the drag pageants that she put together included both trans girls and cis drag performers, and there were also a lot of lesbians in the audience, and there was something always very inclusive about everything that Flawless did, which actually is really similar to the leather community. I just wanted to tie that together because that was always my attraction to the leather community as well. That they were so inclusive and so accepting and actually intersectional and intergenerational, long before anyone else was even attempting to think along those terms. And it was, there was this, we will take you. We have no judgment here. We will take you in. And Flawless was that way as well. So Flawless performed for many years and, continued to perform until she died, and was a mentor to so many incredible artist and was a mentor to me and a very dear friend.
She passed away in I think 2017. It's just been a few years.
Yeah, it's just been a couple of years actually. And we met in 2009, I believe was when we met. I was working on a project called Dorian, a Cinematic Perfume, which was the piece that I showed at Leslie Lohman, right? And it's an adaptation, a multi-screen installation adaptation of the picture of Dorian Gray. And I was almost done with it. And a friend of mine, Chris Tanner, who you may know, who's an artist and performer, I was talking to Chris about my project and he goes, Dorian Gray, if you're doing Dorian Gray, you have to meet Flawless Sabrina. She is Dorian Gray. And I didn't know who Flawless was at the time. So I was fascinated. I said, okay. So I got Flawless's number. I went up to her apartment in the Upper East Side. She lived right off of Central Park on 73rd Street in this jewel box of an apartment that she had been living in since the late 1960s, since she moved to New York, actually. And I get there and I knock on the door and Hollywood Lawn opens the door. And I was just floored. I couldn't believe it. I spent all afternoon sitting in a room with Flawless Sabrina and Hollywood Lawn. And it was probably one of the best days of my life. It's just incredible. So we worked on, so she became Dead Dorian. As in my piece, when Dorian dies, she, kind of breaks through the mirror and meets her dead self. Right. So Flawless was incredible to work with during that piece. And then I just loved working with her so much and we became good friends. So the next piece that I did called Irma Vep, The Last Breath, based on the 1915 film Les Vampires, I knew I wanted Flawless to be in. And so we started to develop that project together and she brought in Zackary Drucker. And it's Great. The two of them.
And we're going to see a clip of that in a moment, I think. But so let's back up a little bit about Irma Vep and just give the audience some context for the Irma Vep story as well.
So, yeah, Irma Vep. Okay, so the film Les Vampires is a French film that came out in 1915. It's one of the first serialized films back when they did these serialized films, to get people in the theater. They'd roll out a different episode every couple of weeks. And it's really a cops and robbers caper that's just kind of cloaked with this idea of vampires and gangs. But at the center of it is this woman, Irma Vep, who slinks around at night in this black cat suit, stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. I mean, essentially the subtext of the film is the working class versus the ruling class. And the vampires are a street gang, loosely based on the actual Apache gangs that were, running around the streets of Paris during 1915. This film was made during World War I. So the streets were really empty. And in fact, it had male leads, and Irma Vep doesn't show up until like the third episode because all of the male leads kept getting called to the front. So they all had to leave. And Musidora, the actress who portrays Irma Vep, ended up being the star of the film, quite by accident due to the fact that all of the men had to go continue to fight in the war. So I just had been fixated on her since I saw her, ever since I was probably 17 or 18, the first time I saw that film. And it really, in some ways, Irma Vep and Catwoman from the Batman show became my first fetish icons. And it was this fascination with this figure of Irma Vep that really inspired me to make this piece. I mean, she was like, I was carrying her around forever. She'd always be on a postcard on my wall or somewhere. And then when I finally decided to make a project about her, I really discovered a lot of things about the actress who portrayed her, Musidora, who became this huge celebrity at that time because the film was such a big hit. And, you know, she was like Madonna. She was just like known everywhere. And she had her one name, Musidora. And she would just, you know, sign love letters to people. People would send her love letters and she'd sign them and send them back. And she actually went to the front lines to, you know, inspire the troops. And she used her fame to become one of the first female feature film directors in Europe, which is, most people don't know about this because she was really this wild radical artist. Her mother was first wave feminist. Her father was a socialist. She grew up in this intellectual household, and she tried to, every time she would just use Irma Vep, this figure, as her calling card throughout her life. But eventually, you know, she made a handful of feature films, but then the money dried up for her films and she just wasn't popular anymore. And certainly once talking films came around. And the myth was that in her final days, she was a ticket taker at the Cinematic Française.
Oh my God.
And that no one knew the old lady in the ticket booth was actually Musidora, you know, the siren of French cinema. So I knew I wanted Flawless to play the old Musidora, this old woman who is just stuck in this ticket booth and waiting for something, like, you know, it was just her in-between space, like she was in not quite purgatory. I mean, I don't want to be religious about it, but it was this vacuum that she found herself in. And when Zackary came in, the piece really became about, I mean, it was both, when I started to put it together, it was really about the aging female artist and how her work is forgotten and no one cares about her and no one invests in her. All they care about is that thing you did when you were 18 years old and you looked really hot in that black cat suit slinking around, you know, but you've got more ideas, but no one wants to see them. And how, you know, the aging female artist just gets frozen in time and, you know, in their youth. And how this agency, talking about power relationships again, I think a lot about the power relationship between the artist and their work, and how when you're making something, you know, it's a struggle always. And like sometimes the artwork wins and sometimes you're winning and sometimes the art is killing you, you know, and then it goes out in the world and the artwork has its own life. And so I started to think about that as well, and how like my art goes a lot more places than I go, you know, and it meets a lot more people than I do. And so how this creation has agency, and yet there's this constant conversation going on between artist's work and the artist at every stage of their life. You look back at your work and you have different conversations with it. And so the film was about that, but it was also about Zackary and Flawless's relationship and how that mirrored what I was looking at in relationship to Musidora and her character, Irma Vep, and this idea of the passing on of intergenerational queer history. And yeah.
What year is this film?
2013.
Okay. You have a clip of that for us to see now.
I do. So I'm actually have a little bit of a clip from Dorian and then a little clip from Irma Vep too.
Great. All right. So let's see the Dorian one first.
Okay.
Yes, this installation at Leslie Lohman was amazing.
Well, this will just be the single channel
Yeah.
version.
Yeah.
I'm just a simple man. I have to do the simple things that a simple man can. You are holding out your hand. You want to know the simple things in my simple plan. And I know there's so much to share, so what else can I do? I'm just a simple man. Come now, take my hand. Now and forever, never to be lonely. I'm just a simple man. I do the best I can. Now and together, just remember only that I'm simple man.
Wow. Of course, the similarities to what's going on today in certain people's families is really just sort of astonishing seeing those images right now.
Yeah.
They're overwhelming.
Yeah.
And of course, at the time that you made this, you had no idea of the situation that we were going to be in today.
Well, no, of course not. And for me, it's so heartbreaking too, as I put some of these clips together for Flawless's memorial. And, you know, I didn't know while I was making that Flawless was going to be dying and gasping for air just a couple of years later. So, yeah, this bittersweet fragility of life and death is something that has always been beating inside me, due to various things that have happened to me throughout my life. And so it's there on that edge that it feels like the important information is in terms of what it means to be human.
Yeah, there is such an amazingly present sense of humanity in seeing that. One thing I want you to speak about a little bit is and you touched on this a little bit earlier, but the intergenerational story that you were telling here and how important that is to this particular piece and the message you wanted to get out there.
Yeah, well, it's important, looking at BloodSisters as well, realizing when I made it, I originally thought of it in terms of it being a piece of history. Even while I was making it, I thought, you know, this is important to exist. I didn't think it would be an important film, and you know, I don't really know if it really is, but I just I thought it was important, and I needed it to exist so people could find it and look back and understand what these women were doing and how important that was and how it led to greater freedoms for some people.
Mhm.
And so with Irma Vep, it was similar in the sense, but it was different actually. It was more about the living archive of intergenerational legacies, and how actually there was no one I knew who embodied that more than Jack, who's Flawless Sabrina, Jack, and Zackary, because when Zackary was transitioning and just coming out, she met Flawless, and Flawless became her grandma, and their love for one another and their respect for one another and their mirroring of one another, but making 1 + 1 = 3. You know, it's so much greater than the sum of its parts. And they built not only bodies of work together, but an incredible legacy as Jack became a very big trans supporter and trans activist. And Zackary and Diana Tourget worked on creating the Flawless Sabrina archive. And both of them had just led such incredible lives of breaking boundaries and making space for other people to feel comfortable in their own skin. And to see them work together and share that information and make each other bigger in present time was just awe-inspiring. And so I wanted to capture some of that in Irma Vep, although it's subtext, it's hidden in there.
And again, if people want to see the full film, how do they do that now?
Well, right now, Kino Lorber has just released a restored version of The Queen, which was the 1968 documentary film on the drag pageant that Jack was running, and stars Jack. It's an amazing film. And if you buy their releases, they've included Irma Vep, The Last Breath on it, along with a 15-minute documentary I made about my work with Flawless.
Wonderful. Great, great. And maybe Emery, you can post that link for people here. And so if you have questions, folks, now's the time that we can start posting them. And I see that there's one here that someone writes to us. Some years ago, I read that the S&M scene was struggling to survive because younger queers weren't so into it. The article said that the new generation had greater acceptance and visibility and didn't feel the need to punish themselves. They weren't internalizing or reclaiming violence as part of their sexuality. And the note is made here that analysis may be gay male oriented. So the quick question for you, Michelle, is do you think that that's a fair or an accurate reading?
I'm really not the person to ask about that because I don't hang out with the youngins. But from what I've been learning recently, is that's not very accurate right now. There is a big scene of queer kinky folk, huge. And in fact, when we did our talk for Outfest, we were talking about the scene in LA. So I think though, just like there always was, there's always this backlash. And right now we are in a time that is so politically correct. And we have cancel culture and people calling out everyone for saying anything that people find offensive in any way, silencing that. And of course, plenty of people find S&M offensive. So I'm sure plenty of people are being silenced. And I've also heard about a lot of discussions amongst young queer kinksters where there's a lot of arguments about labeling and naming, and not simply call me by my preferred pronoun, but actually contesting who can call themselves a dyke, who can call themselves a femme, who like who owns these words and who has the rights to use them. And I think that is prevalent today, and it was prevalent back then too. That's something, that backlash always comes up. And I do not condone it at all, just to be on the record for that. People do it and call themselves whatever the fuck they want.
Well, of course, and I think that makes the most sense. But it is interesting to have this conversation about the cancel culture, because I think we're seeing now a backlash to a lot of that stuff that's going on. And not that it's going to put us on the same page with Ivanka Trump, but it is sort of a bizarre thing that's happening. And I think there are many people of similar points of view who simply just want everybody to be heard and let them be heard however they want to be heard. And it's been interesting watching everything that's been going on with this Philip Guston show as well too. And that's been fascinating. Our friend Liz Collins asked a question here about, she's noticed in the past few years that SM has become way more mainstream, both in queer culture and beyond, other than shades of gray. And do you have any thoughts about some of the reasons why?
Hey, Liz. I always think that it became really mainstream or started to become mainstream shortly after I made BloodSisters, when Madonna released that book, Sex. So maybe if people aren't old enough, of course, they don't remember that book. But that book must have come out in the mid-90s, if not early 90s. And there was a lot of S&M imagery in that. And of course, you can't get any more mainstream than Madonna. And that book was, it was a hit. It was controversial. It was in all the bookstores. It was giant, and it had like wrapping over it, so you couldn't look at it. So it had the whole taboo, forbidden labeling, which of course makes it more desirable. And I feel like because she was working with Herb Ritz and Stephen Meisel, the other photographer that she works with, I think she was working with a lot of fashion photographers. And I think that, to me, that's when S&M became mainstream and entered into the fashion world.
Yeah, and it's so funny if you just look back and think about so many of these things, and you think about what happened with gay male imagery in the 1980s and sort of the gay male clone and Tom of Finland. And now in sort of that look, the tight t-shirt and the tight pants and the muscular body. And now you can go any place and you can see a bunch of straight people, and a bunch of straight men that 20 years ago we would have thought they were all gay based upon, the things that they had sort of taken in and how society had assumed those things. Well, this has been a great conversation, Michelle, and it's been wonderful to see you. And thank you, everybody, for joining us here this evening. If you have not been able to hear the whole thing or have friends who'd like to see it, please let them know that they can see the link on Facebook, and also it'll be posted on our website at stonewall-museum.org. Be sure to check that out for everything that's going on there. And everybody take care of yourself. As they say, these next couple of months, we're now in the beginning of December, but these next couple of months are going to be a little bit rough with the pandemic. Hopefully we'll see some good stuff on the other side of it. So take care of yourself and each other. And Michelle, again, wonderful to see you. Thank you so much. And I can't wait till we get to give each other a big hug in person. So
me too. Thank you. And thank you everyone for coming. And yeah.
And
bye. I want to hug everyone.
Emery, know yourself again. Thank you for being here. And we'll see you all next week. So long, everybody. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.